So why can't you afford a home? Why can't young people today afford a home? There's no bigger issue in our society today than the astronomical increases in home prices and rents that are afflicting families all over the Western world. And while our big media and our government continue to pretend that they just can't really quite get a grasp of the situation, they can't really explain the source of the problem, and therefore they can't prescribe a solution to it, I was able to look at this situation and to readily determine what the source of the problem was. And you know what? If you can follow some basic graphs in the next few minutes, you're going to be able to figure out what our big media and our government can't seem to get a grasp of. First of all, how big a problem are we talking about? Well, it's a gigantic problem. Okay, here's an article from Market Maker. Their data shows that 52% of young adults currently being forced to live with their parents. Okay, this is destroying the fabric of our entire society. Okay, and by the way, by young adults, they mean people up to 30 years old. So in other words, the most common living arrangement for young adults up to 30 in Western nations is to be forced to live with their parents. So we've got a national and international crisis going on, and so I don't understand why is it that no one in the governments or the media is interested in getting to the root cause of this problem? Well, when you figure out what the answer is, then you're going to understand why that's the case. So I decided to look at this situation, try to figure out what the hell's going on. This is a chart of home price to income ratios around the world. And the first thing you notice is that not all nations have experienced this very odd disconnect between incomes and home prices. So that's very interesting, okay? Another way of demonstrating this was this graph that I drew. Why is it that the USA, the UK, Canada, and Ireland have seen exponential home price growth, while these other four nations, Japan, Poland, Slovenia, and Russia, have seen almost no home price increases? So if we can figure out what the difference between these nations are, we can solve this mystery. So since I'm a citizen of the United States, I figured the first chart I should look at would be the United States. And what we notice is that there was a historic correlation between home prices and family income that existed up until about 1970. And that after that time, home prices began to disconnect from this historic relationship. So we entered a new world right about 1970. And being a citizen of the United States, growing up in this time period, I remember that what had happened during this time period was that our government decided to open the borders and start allowing mass immigration to enter our nation. And since that time, we've seen near exponential increases in home prices, but relatively flat wages. So I pulled up a chart of the UK, and what I found was the exact same situation, but at different time intervals. So the UK also had this historic correlation between salaries and home prices that existed throughout history, and then starting in the late 80s, and then really exploding with the new millennium, home prices began to also disconnect from their historic correlation with salaries in the UK. Well, what took place in the UK during these time periods? The borders of the country were slowly opened, and different waves of mass migration took place in the UK. Next, I decided to take a look at Canada. This is another nation that I know very well, and I've spent a lot of time in Canada. I've lived a good portion of my life in Canada, and what you'll notice with Canada is that up until about the year 2000, Canada also had this very tight correlation between home prices and incomes, and then after the year 2000, off to the races, literally exponential growth in home prices as the borders were fully open. So I think we've found our solution here. Now, just to confirm that, I decided to look at where they haven't had mass immigration. And what you'll notice here with the housing chart of Japan is that their home prices have actually dropped over the last 30 years. They've actually dropped. Now, what could possibly explain that? Next, I decided to look at Slovenia, another country that has not allowed mass immigration. And what you see is there's been no inflation in home prices at all. Next, I decided to look at the nation of Poland. Poland, big NATO partner, a very prosperous nation in Europe. Poland has seen no exponential rise in home prices, and they've seen no disconnect between their incomes, between family incomes and home prices that are found in the UK, the United States, Canada, and other open borders nations like Australia. Here's home prices in Russia. What we notice is that there's been basically no home price inflation in Russia during this entire time period. Just for the nail in the coffin, let's look at UK in detail. And what these are regional home price ratios. And what you see, just to put the nail in the coffin here, what you see is that the areas of England, London, the Southwest, the areas of England that have experienced most of the mass migration are the areas that are experiencing the exponential growth in home prices. Whereas areas of the UK that have not experienced much mass migration, like for instance Scotland and Wales, their home prices are flat over this 20-year period of time. So we've now figured out what all these high-paid Ivy League professors and our big media and our government have been unable to figure out, and that is that mass immigration is the source of the housing crisis. In my next video, we're going to take a look at this cost of living crisis that's also taking place in the Western world and see if we could figure out what the source of that problem is also.